It's October 12th, and I was saying Michelle Erickson did have at least one visitation, or she did monitor at least one of the visits between me and my son. And the results of that visit I found to be less defamatory than what the visitation monitor had been writing up. However, I think that later I did read another one of her reports, and it was worse. So I don't know for sure what her motives were from one point to the next. But initially, at least the one report that I did get at first, it wasn't as bad as what was being said by others that were really lying. The one thing that she made a huge deal about and wrote into her report was something that was not a big deal. And I feel that it was probably just because I feel that it was a matter of not having cultural education on the topic. Because it was an instance of having one white American woman, who looked at me as a white American woman, and who expected me, I guess, to therefore be like her, or like most other white American women, and maybe to have the same kinds of tastes or habits, or styles of raising their children. I had brought a small bag of Cheetos Fiery Hot corn chips, those little, like the Cheetos, the ones that are little, kind of little, well, anyway, everybody knows what Cheetos are, right? And it wasn't just the cheesy kind, it was the kind that says on the outside Fiery Hot. And when I was pregnant, I ate very hot, spicy foods. I never threw up during my pregnancy. And I found out later that possibly a reason for that is because I never let myself get hungry. I always kept food in my stomach, and I therefore never had really, aside from the very first initial waves of nausea, I never had any problem with that at all. And I ate all of the same foods that I was used to eating before, but I ate a little more healthfully. And I still ate really hot things, chili pepper hot. And when the baby is in the womb, they basically get the same things. They taste and they receive the same foods that you're eating as an infant. When my son was then eating adult food, and I seasoned maybe my chicken soup with a little cayenne pepper, or basically red chili pepper of some kind, my son loved it. He never complained or acted like his mouth was burning or anything, and I only gave him small amounts at a time. And then one time I did get some of the Fire Hot Cheetos, and I was eating them, and he saw them and he wanted to try it, and I said it's very hot, and I decided to let him try it because he was over a year old, and he was about almost 1.5 at that time. And and I just broke off the very end of a piece and let him try a really tiny piece, and then I waited to see how he did with that. And he really liked it. I tried to give him something else, but he wanted that again. So I said, oh, it's going to get a little bit hotter though if you keep eating them. And he wanted a little bit more, so I gave him a little bit more. I never gave him, like a handful of those Fire Hot Cheetos. But I gave him, in small amounts, enough to taste and sample and see what it was like, and you know, watched him to see if it was not agreeable to him. And it was fine. I mean, I would never just hand him a bag of those and, you know, let him eat the whole bag. But, and for me personally, I can eat them, and they're not that hot to me. I mean, everyone has a different quote-unquote thermometer and an ability to adapt or adjust to what is hot for them or not. There are people who eat very, very hot things, and it seems very mild to them. And then there are people who are sort of those who don't really eat chili peppers and that kind of thing, who get, you know, when they get salsa, they're getting the mild pace picante type salsa, or some kind of a, you know, or they're just used to more Americanized things. And so she basically snapped at me for giving my son, in one of our visits, a small piece of the Fire Hot Cheetos. My son wasn't reacting badly at all. She just freaked out because in her opinion, it was, here she was allowing, okay, here, this woman saw my son showing up with cuts to his face, huge black eyes, chipped tooth, bruises all over his legs and everything, and then she's freaking out over my giving him a little piece of Fire Hot Cheetos, which my son, I had already, you know, tried with him. It wasn't the first time I'd ever tried it, and he had no problem with it. And she freaked out as if I was torturing my son. I mean, here she's allowing these real forms of torture. And she wrote me up and said that the visit was going to be discontinued because I gave him a Cheeto. And I couldn't believe it. I mean, she wrote it up to make it sound like I was completely an irresponsible parent who was putting my son into danger and who did not have good judgment as to what a baby should eat. I mean, this is the woman who's never been a nanny, who's never had her own kids or anything. And no, I haven't given other parents' kids Fire Hot Cheetos, but they weren't my kids either, and they weren't eating hot things like I was all the time. And they had not developed in my womb when I had been eating spicy things, or, you know, or had someone give them really small bits of something to try. And so that was written up into this huge incident. And that's the kind of thing that Michelle Erickson did. The other thing that, aside from not reporting torture and allowing that, the other thing that she did was to jump to some really wild claim that my son was binge eating when he was around me. And she made this claim right after my son and I were forced back from Canada when I was trying to get political asylum. And because Canada had scheduled a speech therapist meeting for him, and the U.S. hadn't done anything, and they basically had tortured him, they decided to be proactive all of a sudden and claimed that they were going to schedule speech therapy for my son because they said I had traumatized my son. So now it was no longer denying that there was something wrong. Now they were trying to blame me. And they were trying to say that he was mute or something because of trauma, and that's not what the case was. The case was that he was still trying to talk, but he wasn't able to articulate the same thing since he'd been tortured. And so they had me meet one of the speech therapists, with my aunt there, the speech therapist, the social worker, and then my son Oliver. And the first thing that my son did was go over to me, and when they gave him some snacks to eat, he took those snacks over to me, and this was 3 months after he had been removed from me, he took them over to me and he wanted to eat them with me. And I remember the look on my aunt's face, that she looked like she felt bad that he didn't want to eat them with her. And I could tell then that she had already bonded to my son, and I figured that she wanted to, she was clearly attached to him already and wanted to adopt him. And I just thought, because I was really surprised that she looked disappointed that he didn't go to her. And I thought, well, why wouldn't she think that he would go to me? I'm his mother. And so he went over to me and started eating, and then his appetite picked up. His appetite picked up because he wasn't able to eat, and he was extremely thin, because as long as CPS had separated us, he was traumatized and depressed. We ate together. Whenever he had ever eaten, he always ate with me. Eating together was something that was never done he never ate by himself. He was never sat at a table to eat on his own. He was never given some food to eat in his room. If he wasn't breastfeeding, which was with me, his mother, right next to me, obviously. If he wasn't breastfeeding or being given breast milk where I was holding him the entire time, that's the other thing. When I expressed my breast milk, I didn't do what a lot of mothers do and just put my son in the crib and then give him a bottle to hold on to. Having the bottle did not negate the necessity of my son's need to be held, and I knew that. So I always continued the bond by holding my son and sacrificing my own personal independence and time to which I could have, maybe put my son in a room, given him a bottle, and had my hands free to do things for myself. But I didn't choose that. What I chose for myself and my son was to continue the bonding. And I continued to hold my son at every feeding while he had a bottle. I held my son, I looked in his eyes, and I talked to him while he was eating. He was never put in a car seat and given a bottle. He was never put in a crib and given a bottle. He never fell asleep with a bottle. He fell asleep next to me because we co-slept. And every time that he ate with me. Or he was eating or drinking his milk while being held by his mother, who loves him. And when he then was able to eat solid foods, I introduced those things to him, and I'd never bought the prepackaged baby food, Beecher stuff, and nothing against that at all, against packaged foods, because sometimes in a pinch, it's nice to have. Maybe once or twice I bought one jar. But typically I still bought all organic food for him, and then I pureed it. So he was still getting really optimum nutrition from me. And every single time that we ate, that my son was hungry, and when he was eating solid foods, well, first, he was eating table food, so I was feeding him, and I always sat next to him, and I fed him with a spoon, and talked to him, and he was eating with me, with his mother next to him. And when he was able to eat finger foods and eat some things on his own, he always ate with me. I never sat my son down at the table and then started doing something else while he ate, and then maybe just joined in now and then. I didn't sit him in front of the TV or turn my back to him ever. When my son was eating, I sat down at the table with my child, and I ate with my son. And I noticed that as soon as I was eating with my son, he was eager to eat more and to eat, because it was a nurturing and social thing, and a social bond that had been developed between us.